Welcome to the Capitol Theater Conversations, Industry Edition. This series of educational and informative offerings is made possible by the generous support of our sponsor, the law firm Capuzzo PLLC, with additional support from Baker Boyer Bank, Fresh Hop Group, G.H. Moen LLC, the Moen Family, Red and Carolyn Ramsey, Yakima Sunrise Rotary, and from donors just like you. Welcome back. I am so thrilled with these conversations because it gives me an excuse to have conversations with dear friends, longtime friends, who I might not otherwise have the reason to call, just because I'm so busy. You're so busy. We're all so busy. But what a great opportunity for me to welcome and introduce to all of you a dear friend, longtime friend. She knows way too many stories about me. Laura Marsh. Laura, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This will be fun.
Laura, one of the reasons that I specifically asked you to join us today was not only because I love you so much, but also because you represent that category of creatives. When Laura and I met 10 years ago, back in St. Louis, Laura was not someone I would have referred to as a creative because Laura was so focused as a researcher in a biology-focused enterprise, which we'll get into. But since then, what I've become so much more clear about is one of the reasons why we click so much is that she really is a creative. And Laura, what I love is that you have had the chance to explore so many different aspects of that creative essence that you are since you got out of school and you're researching, and your research wasn't the primary focus. So I would love to take people through a little bit of a timeline of where you started and how you've gotten to where you are. So, Laura, first of all, when we met in St. Louis and we were doing, monthly game nights and always had the best conversations because you could always talk about so many different topics, you tell us about what your area of study was and what you got your degree in.
Yeah, so in St. Louis, I was working on my PhD. I was actually in the anthropology department at Washington University, but I was also part of the biology department at UMSL. I had advisors there and also had advisors over at Missouri Botanical Garden. So it was a little bit of combination of all that. The main focus of study was primates and fragments, and I ended up studying howler monkeys in Belize. And ran an experiment, kind of a natural experiment, where there was a bunch of monkeys living in some fragmented forest, eating lots of fruit and pooping them out and seeing how that forest regenerated based on the poo. And then had a fragment that didn't have them in it for decades or something to compare the floristics, right? That was the basic thing I was doing in graduate school. Yeah.
And it was always lovely because you were one of those jet setters that would travel the world because you were constantly heading off to the bush, heading off into the jungle of Belize to study monkeys, and then you come back with great stories. And I always loved all these conversations. Now it's not like you don't do that anymore.
Oh, I still do it. Oh, I do. So
Very
to the
much.
point. Oh yeah, so since you've seen me, I don't know how many. At the time, I'd already racked up several countries because as a kid, I'd had my 15th birthday, for instance, in Mombasa, Kenya, right? So, I started early traveling around the world. I've now worked and lived in 32 countries. And so some of that is mostly has to do with monkey business. Yeah. Studying monkeys of one kind or another. My most recent one that I did in the actual field was in 2017. Called Houseboat Amazon, where we went and looked for a missing saki monkey. It hadn't been reported alive since the 1930s, and we went on this big expedition. I did the big social media dealio and all this educational outreach, and in addition to the science stuff. And we schlepped down there and found it and did a lot of video about it. And so now we're trying to put together documentaries so more people can see about it as well as the scientific research. And so that was the last proper, oh no, I take it back. So last fall, it wasn't my own study. That's why it threw me off. I actually was a co-professor in Madagascar on behalf of some students in New York who are at Stony Brook. And so there's a colleague friend of mine, Pat Wright, who has a huge, amazing research center called Center Valbio. And so I was there for a month and a half, 2 months, something like that,
Yeah.
as one of the professors teaching field school in Madagascar, where I'd never been before. So it was fantastic. I got to see lemurs and learn stuff with the students. It was amazing.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of people around the globe, therefore, that know you to be the monkey lady. I mean, you have this reputation and you have this global acclaim, and you are a specialist. I still remember a story you were sharing. You were going through the archives of museums, checking the bones that they had in the many drawers
Mm-hmm.
to say whether or not they were your monkeys, like the monkeys that you were studying.
Right. So really close, really well remembered. I mean, so what I was doing at the time, actually, I was like switching hats again, because again, all of science is interesting to me, and therefore, if I can learn how to do it, I'm interested. That's it. I can't do physics. But if so I was switching hats and becoming a taxonomist because I had run across some Saki monkeys, these weird cat fluffy monkey they're not cats, but they look really weird. And didn't know exactly what it was when I was working in Ecuador, which was after when I did my postdoc work and I ended up in Ecuador.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so I had some colleagues encourage me to try to figure out what was going on because they're a really difficult group. So I ended up, going around the world, all over Europe, all over Latin America, in the forest, trying to hunt down what these guys were. And at the end of the day, I did a big document that came out in 2014, revising the entire genus of the group, and I named 5 new species to science.
What you normally do it in everyday life. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it took almost 10 years because I mean, it was a lot of schlepping around and really figuring it out. And these guys were hard. And yeah, I mean, so
And
that's
most people, only get a single species in 10 years.
agreed. I mean, I was greedy. And and it was one of those things where I had great anxiety actually about naming species because I didn't know if I wasn't classically trained as a taxonomist. I became a taxonomist because I am trained by our taxonomists in our field and other museum curators. And so I felt really confident by the time I published it that I was a taxonomist. I didn't begin that way. And so I kept finding things that made real sense taxonomically, morphologically, location-wise, all the data, historical. I went back 200 years and read every document in German and Portuguese and French and all this stuff just to make sure I had it right. And still I didn't want to do it. And colleagues of mine at the time were like, no, these are different. You're going to have to do this. This is the way it goes. Yeah.
Well,
So
I think that people certainly do acknowledge and recognize the fact that not only do you have this vast array of knowledge and these passions that you share so effectively, but you share them in a way that's engaging and intriguing, and people look to you because you become, therefore, the most outspoken and best speaker on behalf of these monkeys or on behalf of the field. I was also impressed because from early on, I was very clear about the extraordinary writing skills that you have, so I keep having more and more layers of you as a creative showing up. You are a performer who never wants to be on stage, but you're constantly in front of a podium.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, true, because I think in this new version of the video age, I mean, we being my organization, Global Conservation Institute, we realized last year that maybe what we should do is a video cast called Sandwalk, and I could get out behind my house here and walk around in the dirt and talk about topics like have climate change or whatever it is that people are really struggling with. We started getting that kind of organized, did one little teaser trailer, and then the pandemic hit, and suddenly I became the it girl for COVID. So now I'm like COVID message girl. And I'm not a virologist, I'm not an epidemiologist, not an MD, but I work with fellow scientists and people who do the modeling and all those kinds of things. And yeah, I've always been an educator. In St. Louis, I was doing education work, right? And I was doing stuff with communities, and I just really find it important. And not every scientist is good at being able to give the message of whatever it is, not dumbing it down, but translating it so whatever audience, kindergarten through 80 years old, that you can say it in a way that it hits their ears and resonates. And I somehow am okay with that.
I think it's also the case that people could still look at all of that information and still refer to you as a really good lecturer or a really good
researcher, and they could say, this is why she's good. So they may not still refer to you as a creative. And within the industry, one of the things we're looking at is how creatives, as this sort of new concept of category, cross all the different industries. And they do so in a way that we are learning that creatives are present in all these industries, and what they do is maybe titled in different ways, but the skill set and what they're doing is really consistent across these various industries.
Mm-hmm.
And so we could say you're just a great lecturer, we could say you're just a great researcher and all these, but then you move to New Mexico,
Yeah.
and suddenly you're the owner of a comic book store.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, there's
And
that.
so there's now, okay, and she's an entrepreneur, great. But then you're creating comic books. Now,
So, right. I mean, so backtracking a bit, I do this in science too. I like to kind of go back to the original. I've always written stories from the time I was a kid. I always made up stories. I always really could embody different characters and write all kinds of stories. But the messaging I got as a kid was, that's not a job. That's fun. But, being an author is never going to pay you anything, right?
Yeah.
So so it was like, okay, so then I could use my skills, and of course I've published books and done all these other things in science. But yeah, it really did finally, I bought the comic book store. It was really ridiculous.
As one does.
As one does. I was working at Los Alamos National Lab as one of the technical staff member scientists.
By the way.
By the way. And in my household, we had two big incomes at the time. And I've been a comic book reader forever. It's a great medium. There's so many creative, interesting things. And yes, now there are films and whatever, but even before that, so many interesting, creative ways to tell story. And it's like carrying a little movie around with you, right? With the paintings and everything. Fantastic. So yeah, the reason I got into it, I moved here to Santa Fe, and I needed a comic book store. And there was just this yucky one in Santa Fe by this woman who hated all the comic book boys and all the fringe people, which I love, of course.
Yes, all your friends.
Yeah, and all my friends, right? And so I thought, and so she didn't want much for the inventory that she had. And once we figured out to get a place to rent, swear, hand to God, this is what I said was, well, how hard can it be? Oh my God, right? I had no idea, right? I had no idea how to write this. No idea. I had no idea.
You weren't naive.
Oh my, come on. And then comic books are even harder than if you had something like literally any other store, because you track every artist, every number, every writer, every series, every every blah blah blah, and you have one book that has 4 covers because they're chase, and then you have characters and and oh my goodness. And of course we had to do, it's me, and I love art. My dad years ago when I was a kid used to own art galleries in the 60s, and so ours was True Believers Comics and Gallery. And for any of your listeners out there, you're like, True Believers, yeah, I actually got the trademark on that name before Stan Lee. And when I met Stan, gave him a business card. I did. Yes, I did. I have a hand-drawn Spider-Man from Stan Lee. When I met him, I gave him my business card and I said, yeah, we now co-own this name, because they came after me at one point. They wanted to have a comic book called True Believers Comics, because it was something he always said, stay in there, True Believers, or whatever, right? And so yeah, but I had a logo, I had the name, I tacked that shit down. And so, yeah. And so when I met Stan, his guys standing next to him take the business card and they get on their phones and they're like, who is this woman? And they're like, oh yeah, we do legally co-own this name, because they came for me, and I just went, okay, I don't have to own it by myself. And I know they didn't pay me anything because they were big bullies. They didn't pay my lawyers. So Marvel's a bunch of big bullies is what I gotta say. But anyway, I co-own the name True Believers with them. So anyway, that was the comic book thing. But because of that, I would go to Comic-Con, of course, and I would meet all these wonderful, my heroes, whoever they happen to have been, artists and writers. And I had a guy named Greg Rucka say to me, he actually was the one who wrote the comic book for The Old Guard, is a movie that's out now on Netflix. Anyway, He said to me when he was here and we took him out to dinner, whatever, he said, look, you know what? You just start doing it. If you've always had stories, you just do it. You don't,
Yeah.
if you need someone to tell you, then just go. So I was like,
Yeah.
okay. So now I'm working a full-time job. I'm doing science, and now I'm like hammering out stories.
And you still have the comic book store, of course.
Well, no.
Oh, that
we
one you
sold
just
that.
switched. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we had it about 10 years, and then we sold it to our manager, and we've got it online still. And it mostly is there just to represent kind of thing. It's not.
Right.
Of course, I had a monkey gallery as well. So every time I went to Comic-Con or any artist came to my shop, they had to draw monkeys for me. And actually, I had the monkey gallery online because it's kind of fun.
Yeah. Trust me, you'll have links. We'll have links to this so that people can have a chance to see these things. Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, no. So I mean, I finally, and I always wanted to work in film because I'm very visual. So then I ended up meeting some film folks here in New Mexico, and there was a guy who was running a screenwriters conference, and I started volunteering to help with that. And 6 years later, I met loads of producers and writers and other folks, to the point where I end up now, even to this day, have a friend that whenever I'm in LA, because I still have my house in LA because I grew up there.
Yeah.
I have an office in the Wiltern building downtown in LA, and I've met loads of folks. And so we're trying to do more things, but I've got, anyway, now stories and things that I'm working on in that world. So,
and I think it's for people to know, New Mexico has got a great tax incentive program for the film industry. So it really does draw a lot of the, the bigger name agencies and producers into the area. So, you've taken full advantage of those. And then, of course, because you're you, I do want to point out that now there's a whole new situation in which the film stuff, which is continuing to move forward, has now led you into, I believe you mentioned, a musical theater Broadway production?
Yeah.
Because, of course. Tell us how that came about.
It's, I wrote a half dozen or more scripts, right? Just spec scripts on different kinds of stories. And I don't tend to write like robots versus Godzilla, which is Pacific Rim, right? I mean, I don't tend to write that kind of thing where somebody's going to go, oh, that's $1 million. I write things that are interesting to me, and are interesting to people, but are potentially harder to make. So one of the stories I actually won at Nichols. So the Nichols Screenwriting Contest is hosted by the Motion Picture Arts and Academy. And I was a finalist with them about 10 years ago for this one script, which is now called Across the Amazons. And it's about a woman in 1769, Peruvian woman of aristocracy, who decides to mount her own expedition to cross from the Andes to the mouth of the Amazon to re-meet up with her husband, who she hasn't seen in 20 years. And she does it and basically ends up the sole survivor of this expedition. She ends up in the forest alone for like a month and survives, and it's, happy ending. So this is this massive tale, and people love it, but it's one of those hard things because it's, it's 1700s. It's a woman lead. It's a Latin woman lead, which up until recently, Hollywood was really stinky about.
Very much.
It's the rainforest, which that's the easy part. Like, I can schlep a crew down there and make sure nobody dies. That part I've got, right? So for me, it's personal. Sorry?
You've got a skill set.
I got skills. So that part, and loads of people love it. They really want to see it happen. It's been in development for some time, and we're still trying to get the right, we need a budget. We've got a budget made, but we need the production people who want to pay for it, not only just the investors, but we've got a couple of production companies that are waiting to attach, but we have to have the funding, all that stuff. Yeah. So, because it's one of those taking forever to get this thing to happen kind of things. Now in a pandemic, hurrah, I was going to Colombia and Ecuador this year to talk to production companies in person and go look at some locations, but so 2018. So I'd been in the Amazon in 2017 for about 5 months at that point, had come home in 2018. Yes. In 2018, I was in New York for another sciencey thingy, whatever. And a man I know named Ken Davenport now he has a theater, the Davenport Theater on Broadway. He got a Tony for the beach one. What is the beach one where they paraded the goats on the stage with the sand?
Once on the Island.
Once on this Island. He was the producer on that. Got a Tony for it. Nice guy. And so he also had started I'd known him for years before he started doing like his big perspective now is that he wants to be able to have several thousand new musicals on Broadway by like 2030 or some ridiculous thing, right? I mean, so he's really trying to help everybody get going anyway.
Yeah.
So I'd contacted him, we figured it out, and I went and met him on Broadway. I'd sent him like a lookbook and stuff about the movie, sent him a little prospectus, and I said, people have said that this is very operatic. Perhaps it would be really good to have it as a musical. And I said, yeah, my pitch basically was, I don't have time for this.
You sell it,
and
girl.
And he said, it's a musical. I'm like, oh, okay. So, and because I love to write, I mean, so I took the challenge of going from a 3-act film, which is visual media, right? Very easy, to a 2-act on stage with lyrics. So, and now, of course, I found some people. We've made a quick song that didn't really completely fit or work out, but it was great to go through that process and try that. I've now had a dramaturge help me go through and figure out how to do some reconfiguring for stage. And so the point where we're at right now is that it's really ready to have composers, and if somebody wants to lean in and be a director, to really start the nuts and bolts about whatever that is. So we have more of a cleaner package to then be able to see if we can seek funding and get this thing up on stage. So there's that.
I sort of have dealt with all my life, being the person who defines the extreme edge of extroversion. Most people look at me to reduce the number of people in their 6 degrees of separation, because I always seem to know everyone, and I always seem to know everyone across many fields. But I want to indicate for people, the reason I can reduce the number of people in your 6 degrees of separation is because I know people like Laura Marsh.
No, you're supposed to be helping me. That's the thing.
And fortunately we do.
So funny. Yeah, no, and it really has all come down to, both in science, and I learned this early when I was young and a student, before I was ever in graduate school, was the business of go to conferences, go to places you're not used to going. Even if you're a creative, go figure out a musical conference. I mean, I know Ken runs them. Enter contests as well. See who you can meet, see how your stuff matches up. And just meet people. I mean, at conferences, I started so young that I would just go out like dancing and drinking with all these people who ended up being quite literally Jane Goodall, and some of the folks who do all the fancy things for monkeys, right? I mean, so, and primates. And so it just, I mean, so that's one way to do it. Like we ran the screenwriters conference. It gave people the direct opportunity in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which isn't LA. You don't have to do it in some gigantic place, right? But yet you're face to face across from a producer. Now you have to pitch in 5 minutes what your story is, why you think it's blah, 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 and all that stuff. It's great practice. And sometimes you meet people that end up being friends forever that do or do not help you on a project. And that's really valuable as well. I mean, and especially for creatives, I think, whether you get paid or not, whether you are, meet people who do or do not actually ultimately help you. At the end of the day, it's just, you show up somewhere and they go, hey, you know that Laura? Oh my gosh, yeah, I totally know Laura, and suddenly, So.
Well, and you were, it's this generation of young people and the end of the previous generation where it really started showing up among the college students that they didn't choose to do one area of study. You know, back when I was, you know, in undergrad, you know, it very much was the case that everyone had a specific major, maybe a minor. If they were really adventurous, two minors. By the time I left Washington University, all of the students had at least two majors and a minor, and they actually had to institute regulations that kept people from taking any more than that. You know, you could do a total of 3 things, period, so that they could get the students to graduate. Because they were doing these, and then they started crafting their own majors and putting these distinct pieces together that were all personal study things, and then suddenly they became programs that were then specialized within the university. So I think that you were so far afield of that, you know, for this generation, that you were one of those trailblazers that actually was doing that same thing, mixing all these passions and all these loves, because it's not like you weren't going to do them anyway, so you might as well get credit for it all.
Well, that's, you know, it's interesting that you say that, because for both my bachelor's degree, which I did at UC Davis, for my first master's degree that I did at San Francisco State, I actually wrote my degrees exactly for that reason, because I didn't fit in any one department, and I wanted to do more animal behavior, or I wanted to do more of a animal ecology thing. So I had to lump these things together, and I ended up doing independent majors for both my undergraduate and my first master's. But at undergraduate, I had a minor of Shakespeare. So I mean, it was
so your major as an undergraduate was
animal behavior with a minor in Shakespeare.
As one does.
As one does. It was an English minor, but yeah, it was mostly Shakespeare. But yeah.
Your first master's was?
I had the lofty name of ethological ecology, which is basically behavioral ecology. And it's actually what I did for my thesis, was this tropical rainforest education program that I invented, and was going around the country teaching teachers with all this donated material, slideshow, curriculum that I wrote, because there was no rainforest information in the textbooks. And when I was 18, I was standing in one before I ever knew what one was, because I had volunteered to go study monkeys at 18 instead of going to my high school graduation, as one does. But yeah, it just gets crazier and crazier if you really make me say the details, but okay.
Yeah. So the second major then, the second master's was?
At Washington University. So in the course of getting a PhD in the department that I was in, which was the anthropology department under Bob Sussman at the time, you just, through coursework, got a master's degree. And in fact, I didn't really particularly realize it, but I went to the graduation for a girlfriend who was from Ethiopia, and her parents had come from Ethiopia, and we're sitting there and hanging out. And then they read my name, and I'm like, oh, oopsie, excuse me. You know, I'm like not dressed, I don't have a gown, I go running up, I get my degree, I'm like, thank you. You know? So, oh, I didn't know we would do this. Are we doing this? Okay, who knew? But yeah, so that was my second master's, was wash you. Yeah.
I need to put down my drink. I have to go get my degree.
Yeah, pardon me. Just one moment. That was really interesting. Can we circle back to that? I've just got to run. Yeah.
Just a second. And then the title of your PhD is?
Wow. What is the actual title? So I guess I'm an anthropologist by true PhD landia, but because I did so much tropical ecology, in part from UMSL and in part from the botanical garden as part of it, I call myself a tropical ecologist, even though technically, I guess, on my diploma, it would say physical anthropology from Washington University. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Which, of course, I don't know where my diplomas are, because as I was going through school, my mom was always she was just a junior high librarian, but she really very much valued education, right? So, yeah, I did my world of screwing around and what one does in all the various colleges, but to prove that I actually finished, I would mail her my degree. And so in some box somewhere are all my degrees that I mailed to my mom. I don't even know where they are. So.
Oh, I love that. Well, Laura, I want to thank you so much. I know how engaged I get every time we talk, and I love hearing and you know just the tip of the iceberg of the stories that you have to share, and we will make a point of grabbing a few of the links to the websites and to the the Houseboat Horizons, you know, all the different things that you have done to share kind of this perspective in this mix. But I think that especially for our theater audience that are like always excited to hear about new projects, and we'll be tracking to see how the development of the project with Ken Davenport moves along as well. So thank you again so much for being part of this series. Thank you so much for sharing your time. And as always, love you dearly and look forward to talking to you again soon. And
Thank you for having me. This was super great.
And to all of our listeners, please do come back. We've got more to offer and exciting additional chats to have with other friends of mine that just happen to be extraordinary people who work in this industry. Thanks so much.